Now, what we want to argue is that because of these fundamental differences between Semitic religions and what we could call pagan traditions, now there's no value judgment attached to pagan here. Because of these differences, the idea of a secular neutral state becomes extremely problematic in situations of conflict between these two classes, because it's impossible to take a neutral position between the two. And that becomes most clear in a case like the debate over religious conversion today. We'll come back to this during the debate. It's impossible for the secular state to take a neutral position in that debate, because it either privileges Semitic religions like Islam and Christianity and allows proselytization, or it privileges pagan traditions and then it bans proselytization. There's no neutral ground between the two. Now, there's a third problem in transplanting the models and principles of secularism from Western Europe to India. See, these principles were originally formulated within a particular conceptual framework. And when one talked of religion, freedom of religion, neutrality towards religion, separating the state from religion in modern Europe, there was a common theoretical background that allowed one to identify what one was talking about. One knew what religion was, vaguely, but one knew what its characteristic properties were, and what distinguished the political sphere from the sphere of religion. Now, this background, I want to argue, consisted of Christian theology. That is, the distinction between the religious and the secular is a conceptual distinction that is really internal to Christianity, but which has been universalized as though it's a neutral and universal distinction between two spheres that are supposed to exist in all societies. I'll not go into the theology too deeply, but let me just briefly state, if you analyze the debates on the toleration and the secular state in early modern Europe, there's a common theoretical background, a common conceptual background, which is a generic Protestant theology of Christian liberty and what is called the two kingdoms, the political kingdom and the spiritual kingdom. Now, that theology claimed that all human beings live in two spheres at the same time. On the one hand, they live in the spiritual sphere of religion, and that is also the eternal world, where they are souls and they have to look after their salvation and only obey God. On the other hand, they live in the temporal sphere, which is also called this world or this life, where they are bodies who have to look after their material welfare, and there they should obey the laws of the state. And this point was made over and over again, before John Locke, after John Locke, and the basic structure there, the distinction between what is religious and what is secular, corresponded to a distinction between the temporal political world, the kingdom of the secular ruler, and the spiritual kingdom of Christ or of God. Now, what happened from the 17th century onwards is a secularization of this theological model, but not in the sense that it became truly secular or neutral or non-religious. The steps from Locke through Jefferson to Rawls today are not those of a rational enlightenment, which extends its secular values to humanity, but those of an internal religious dynamic of secularization, which spreads Christian principles in a secular guise. So the basic problem is, if you want to have these principles and interpret them, make sense of them, you need a particular theological background. If you don't have that background, you'll end up in interminable disputes about what is religion, what is not religion, how to distinguish between the political and the religious. So consequently, the principles of secularism do not make sense in India, because no theoretical framework required to interpret such principles is available. Here it is unclear, completely unclear, which properties make, say, Hinduism, Jainism, or Sikhism into a religion, and how to distinguish what is religious from what is secular or political. Now, apart from those conceptual issues, Secularism also faces embarrassment in its actual implementation in India in the last few centuries. And we are going to argue throughout the debate that the secular state, modeled after the liberal democracies in the West, is the harbinger of religious conflict in India because of its conceptions of toleration, secularism, and state neutrality. More of secularism in India will end up feeding what it fights, the so-called Hindu fundamentalism or Hindu communalism. Let me very briefly give a historical argument. See, the first state or government to implement principles of toleration and religious freedom that are very similar to those of secularism today was the British colonial government in Bengal. But what happened is, because it came with an inbuilt conception of religion, they had very peculiar effects, these policies. For instance, the British said, we'll tolerate practices, native religious practices, if you can demonstrate that they're religious. Now, how do you do so? Well, you have to demonstrate that they have scriptural sanctions, doctrinal foundations. Practice like sati, hook swinging, infanticide, there's many examples. They started asking, can you show that they have doctrinal foundations? Then we'll tolerate it. If you cannot, we'll abolish the practice. Now, consequently, a new kind of attitude came up in these traditions in India, where to defend the value of one's tradition, one turned to doctrines and truth claims, to show that there's some principle underlying these traditions which is truly religious, which unites them, and which one has to defend. While this strategy had been non-existent before the late 18th century, early 19th century. So in short, the cognitive framework of the secular liberal state here construed Hindu traditions as structural equivalents of Christianity, in the sense that it viewed them as embodiments of a series of scriptural doctrines and injunctions. If Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam embodied different religious doctrines, then a liberal state simply ought to take a neutral position towards their conflicting truth claims and tolerate the practices that embodied these truth claims. However, in the case of traditions that do not look at ancestral practices as embodiments of doctrines, the resulting policy generates a coercive mechanism that compels these traditions to refashion themselves according to this model of religion. And the Indian subjects quickly learned that they needed to give evidence of scriptural and doctrinal foundations to continue practicing their traditions. And that introduced a new attitude of aggressive defense of one's traditions as based in true religious principles. Now, I only have 1 minute left, but very briefly, this kind of problem continues in the Indian secular state of today, and it keeps reinforcing Hindu-Muslim conflict and other kinds of conflicts because it transforms the relations among these communities into a conflict of competing doctrines, and then represents the secular state as a neutral power standing above the conflict of truth claims. Now, I don't have enough time left to make this point completely. We'll make it during the debate. But what happened, in fact, is because the secular state brings with itself the Semitic conception of what religion is, it begins to see all these communities and traditions in society as expressions of doctrines which have to have a rivalry over religious truth. And that becomes a kind of coercive straitjacket which compels communities to solve their problems as though they are religious rivals. And that, we claim, generates more and more Hindu communalism and other forms of communalism. Let me end there.